everyone, welcome to ADRA Asia's podcast, While on Earth.
Happy, efficient and productive.
I'm very passionate about young people.
Currently leading the disaster risk management unit management.
Overnight is a long process.
Welcome everyone to ADRA Asia's podcast, which we like to call While on Earth. Here with me is my friend and my brother from the UK, Howa. Howa, welcome to the show. Who are you?
Thank you very much, Prabhuk. I'm Howa and I'm the Chief Programs Officer at ADRA UK. I've been working with ADRA UK now about close to 16 years.
Wow.
And it's been a great journey so far.
What are you passionate about, Howa?
I'm certainly, of course, passionate about our sector development, and I think my passion for humanity and my passion for wanting to make a difference led me to a career in the sector. But over the last few years, I've become extremely interested in the power of local and indigenous knowledge, and how the knowledge that is embedded within communities, within peoples, within cultures, holds the keys and the answers to development, and maintaining that balance in the work that we do as humanitarian and development actors.
Okay, for the sake of our viewers, can you describe this term indigenous knowledge in development a little bit more?
Sure. So I think some of the challenges we often face as development actors, development agencies, international organizations, when we are working with communities, local groups, there's always the temptation to bring or the perception that there is no know-how or knowledge or skills or capacity in the local context, and the solutions to problems that communities and people may face have to be imported or transplanted from elsewhere, without taking sufficient time to actually understand, well, how have these communities survived and thrived and adapted to challenges over millennia, over centuries, and understanding how to work with these communities to harness, firstly understand the solutions that they have to the challenges that they face, and how to harness those solutions, how to harness that knowledge, whether it's knowledge in terms of agricultural practices, understanding weather patterns, understanding agricultural cycles, understanding animal movement patterns and grazing patterns that have been passed down from generation to generation to generation, but has somehow been lost because many of these communities have been connected to the global economy. So how can we go back to track and map this knowledge that is still there and harness it to emphasize the value in the knowledge, to understand the power that exists in that knowledge, and then utilizing that to help find solutions to whatever challenges or problems these communities are facing.
Wow, do you want to share with us the specific aspects of this topic that you are interested in, maybe with a quick example?
Sure. So I think one very specific example that I'm particularly interested in is around so I'm originally from Nigeria, and there is a very powerful indigenous economic business incubator system that has existed in southeastern Nigeria amongst a group or community within southeastern Nigeria called the Igbo people. And they've had for a very long time a business incubator system called the IGBA system. And how this system works is it's essentially a form of an apprenticeship scheme where a entrepreneur or the entrepreneurial apprenticeship scheme. So you may have an entrepreneur or a tradesperson who would have a mentee who works with them unpaid for a specified period of time. And during that specified period of time, they're learning the craft, they're learning the trade. It might be for 2 years, it might be for 3 years. And within that system, after that specified period of time, the mentor or the entrepreneur is required to provide the seed capital for that apprentice to then set up their own business, their own enterprise.
Okay.
And it continues. So that person who was once a mentee would also then do the same for take on an apprentice and get support and apprentice to work for them over a period of time, and then goes on and goes on and goes on. So this is a powerful sort of business incubator, entrepreneurial incubator that exists in Nigeria, in Southeast Nigeria, and a lot of studies have been going on into it, or a lot of studies are being done into the system now. And there's a famous market in Lagos, which is predominantly based on this apprenticeship entrepreneurial system. And the most recent estimates, it's about $4 billion worth of global trade that's done through this system, through this one market in Southeast Nigeria. So this is an example of how that local indigenous knowledge, methods, approaches can have significant impact. And as development actors, as organizations, how can we begin more systematically to harness this knowledge and harness this capacity to improve the effectiveness of our work and help to improve lives in places we work in?
Wow. So now, as you work in ADRA UK, you're not in Nigeria, right? How do you actually contextualize this in your everyday work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the core principle is understanding that there's value in the people and the communities we work in. I think there's, as we said, there's always this often sort of false narrative or perspective that only knowledge, there's capacities only coming from the West. Knowledge is only coming from the UK or elsewhere in Europe. And that devalues the knowledge, the capacity, the know-how, the power, the strength that exists in many of the places that we work in. So having that core principle in mind, myself and my team were always very cognizant in partnerships, in designing programs with partners around identifying, well, actually, rather than exploring what capacity or knowledge are we going to bring from Europe or elsewhere, but in the first instance, how can we work with our partners, with our local communities, to actually harness the knowledge, to harness the experiences, to harness the know-how that exists in their communities, and utilize those as solutions to the challenges that we're facing. So that core principle is what is embedded in our work as ADRA UK. And one very practical thing that we often do in working in a project or in a program, in the first instance, we always want to identify partners that are in country. So if we're looking for academic partners, rather than finding academic partners in Europe or in the UK, do we have academic partners that understand the culture, that understand the context that we can work with in country? When trying to develop new approaches around doing things. So for instance, one particular area that I'm particularly interested in is the issue of safeguarding and protection. As you know, in our sector, there's been a lot of work around protection issues and safeguarding issues, and developing new systems and approaches and standards and tools for ensuring safeguarding and protection of vulnerable groups and communities, which is very important, as we all agree. But I often find that it's from a very Western Eurocentric perspective of what we understand it means to keep people safe and to protect people. And I strongly believe that in every society, in every culture, it is inherent in every culture, every society, to ensure the security and protection of their people, particularly the most vulnerable. So how can we begin to harness that knowledge? So if we're working in, I don't know, somewhere in Burkina Faso, or if we're working in Nepal or Sri Lanka, and we're working with local communities, what systems exist in those localities to help protect the most vulnerable? How are these communities doing this? How are they throughout history, throughout the culture that has been passed down from generation to generation, what safeguarding mechanisms exist that are unique to that local community that we can harness and uplift, and not completely dismiss the value. Because I think the concern is, and what we often do by, particularly with issues around safeguarding and protection, we inadvertently suggest that there are no values in those communities. There are no values in some of the people that we work with, but they're very strong values, just as important, values that are just as important as our values in the West and in the UK. And how can we ensure that we lift up those values and emphasize the importance and the power in those values?
Wow, thanks. Just for the sake of our audience, could they go into the internet and look up this word Indigenous knowledge in development and find some materials?
Yes.
Do you recommend that?
Yes, absolutely.
And maybe if you have some resources, we can include it in the link
Absolutely,
below.
absolutely. There's an interesting forum called the Indigenous Knowledge Development Monitor, and it's all about that, around how to identify and promote this very concept of how to harness indigenous knowledge, how to ensure that in the design of development and humanitarian programs, we are not inadvertently sort of communicating that there is no knowledge, there is no value in where we're working, but having a tracking system to kind of monitor and share those wonderful examples of how local knowledge, like this IGBA system, how it is making significant impact and how it can have really transformative impact.
The last question, if you had a superpower, what would it be and what would you do with it?
If I had a superpower, what would I do and what would I do with it? I was thinking about this. There were two possible options, but I'll go with the one and maybe linked a bit to this indigenous knowledge. Time travel.
Okay.
So I love history. So history is one of my favorite. Sort of, I studied history at school and very much to quite high level. And the reason why I say history, so time travel. So going back in time, if I could, to remind communities and people of who they were and the greatness that exists in themselves and the greatness that exists in their cultures. Because I think what has happened with modernity and exposure to the global economy and so on and so forth, and exposure to maybe what is perceived as more advanced civilizations, many of us who are from the diaspora African background or Asian background and so on, that have had a history of colonialism, we've been taught to believe that we had no significant history or no significant contribution to humanity. But if I could go back in history to capture that knowledge that existed, that greatness that existed, and come back and show or take people who feel disempowered because of this more recent history, and show the greatness that existed in them, the greatness that existed in those cultures before history happened to them, that can help to bring a sense of pride and a sense of self-worth to many of our people who sometimes feel that they're not perceived as valuable or not perceived as being able to make an impact in the world. So yeah, so time travel specifically to harness that greatness, that knowledge that existed in many of these communities and cultures.
Howa, thank you very much for being on the show.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much for joining us, and please be sure to tune in for our next episode. Goodbye for now.